actually doesn't need to be dark, but that's okay. Good morning.
Good morning.
As Susan mentioned, I'm an anthropologist, and I'm a physical or biological anthropologist. And one of the things that anthropologists do is study human evolution and adaptation. And you're probably all very familiar with fossils, and physical anthropologists studying fossils and fossil evidence for human evolution. Well, there's another group of us that study living people, and we're looking for evidence of past evolution and ongoing evolution, partly because we're interested in explaining the huge range of variation in modern human biology, and also because we have a genuine interest in the science of evolution and how fast does it occur, under what conditions does it occur, does it occur in the same way every place? So that's part of what I'm going to talk about today. And I'm talking about high altitude, and here we are in Denver, which we consider moderate altitude. How many of you are from Denver or higher? A few of you. Okay, so you're going to chime in, right, with questions and comments. How many of you have visited altitude? How many of you have been to Pikes Peak? Yes. All right, plenty of experience. We study adaptation to extreme environments, such as high altitude. And we do this with a basic hypothesis that the solutions to living in extreme environments are the results of a natural experiment in evolution. And one of the things that I'm guessing, although we haven't compared notes, it's possible that the other speakers will be telling you some of the same things. When we're looking at evolution and we're looking at a large organism with a long lifespan, we look at a lot of different stages of the life cycle. We have to include studies of babies, ladies, people working, children, the elderly. And that makes it, of course, a real challenge. But as I'll show, we have some ways of focusing the question. We're going to start also with the fact that high-altitude natives have a number of biological characteristics that are distinctive from those of visitors to high altitude. Now, this is from a kind person on Flickr who allowed his pictures rather, to be used with a Creative Commons license. So we can visit Pikes Peak, those of us from low altitude. And we are what we say acutely exposed. Those of you who have been to Pikes Peak or some other high altitude place, can you give me an example of how you felt? Yes, well done. Deep breathing. Anyone else? Dizzy, headache. Yes.
Couldn't sleep at night.
Couldn't.
In Nepal at 16.
Yes. Okay, thank you so much. I love it when people give me the classic responses.
Fuzzy thinking.
Fuzzy thinking, yes. Sometimes you read about mountaineers who do really dumb things and die or get frostbite, and you think, why were they being so dumb? It was the fuzzy thinking. Yeah, altitude affects your breathing, acute exposure, your breathing, your thinking, your ability to sleep. Now, here, I've got pictures here of several types of high altitude, several geographic areas of high altitude natives. They don't have these problems. We can measure their thinking. It's fine. They're not wheezing. They sleep. We can measure their sleep. They sleep fine. They don't complain of headaches. Ethiopian Highlanders are one group. They live in East Africa. This is an Amhara lady and her daughter. I love this slide. This is Bob Grover, who worked in Denver at the University of Colorado, Denver for decades. He's a very famous high-altitude physiologist. And he was in Peru. He did some of the early studies of Peruvian Highlanders. And Peruvian Highlanders are just, look at that guy's chest. That is not just beach pose, right? They have huge they're short in stature, and they've got big chests. High altitude Tibetans are another group. And there are Tibetans living who never go below 16 or 17,000 feet of altitude in their life. One of the things that has been extraordinary as we have developed more and more knowledge about these different populations is that the biological characteristics that we have when we go to altitude are different from those of the Highlanders. Okay, so they've adapted. But also, the biological characteristics of the Ethiopians, the Andean Highlanders, and the Tibetans also differ from one another. And that is something extraordinary, and we would never have known that if we didn't ask the simple question. After decades of study in the Andes, we thought we knew this is what Highlanders are like. Well, it only took 1 year of study in Nepal first, and then more years, and now many years, of study in other parts of the world to realize that these independent natural experiments have different outcomes. Whoa! So has evolution been acting differently in these three areas? Allow me a long quote from Darwin. I bet each one of us is going to give you a quote from Darwin. This is from his 1858, that famous Darwin-Wallace paper that was published in the Proceedings of the Linnaean Society. And Darwin says, can it be doubted from the struggle each individual has to obtain subsistence that any minute variation in structure, habits, or instincts adapting the individual better to the new conditions would tell upon its vigor and health? So you can present these kind of quotes to your students and you know exactly where you're going, what kind of data you need. In the struggle, it would have a better chance of surviving. And those of its offspring which inherited the variation, be it ever so slight, would also have a better chance. Let this work of selection on the one hand and death on the other go on for 1,000 generations. Who would pretend to affirm that it would produce no effect? Yes, this frames what I'm going to tell you about just beautifully. And it also is impressive when we show this to students. It was written in 1858. It's completely intelligible. It's completely cogent. So I'm going to present evidence for evolution by natural selection among high-altitude populations. First, I'm going to talk about what is the stress. What is this severe environmental stress? And I'm going to talk briefly about the ancestral response. You've also already identified the ancestral response to sudden exposure to high altitude, such as Pike Peak. Then I'm going to present some evidence that the same stress elicits different responses in Andean and Tibetan Highlanders. Both of them have thousands of years of residence. And I'm going to make the point that we can test the hypothesis that natural selection is ongoing in particular, the example I'll use is Tibet. And I'll also, in this talk, present basic concepts of evolution by natural selection, so that after thinking about this and how you might incorporate this information into a lecture that you might present, students will understand the concept of environmental stress and adaptive response. Students will appreciate that heritable variation is necessary and can be identified in humans and can be linked to survival and reproduction. And students will also recognize the value of natural experiments and field work. And I think all of us today are field workers. We're all going to be emphasizing that. First of all, what's the stress? And high-altitude natives represent a great natural population of people exposed to an extreme stress that's lifelong and unavoidable. And here's the stress. Here's altitude from sea level to 1,500 meters, about where we are now, 4,000 meters, Pikes Peak. I better get out of the way. And all the way up to 6,000 meters. I didn't go all the way up to Everest because we don't have people living there. And on the y-axis, we've got partial pressure of inspired oxygen. Whoa! And this didn't translate too well. This is the percent of sea level oxygen on this axis, from 40% to 100%. So let's just think, every time we take a lungful of breath, we're taking in oxygen. As we go up in altitude, the column of air is shorter and shorter, so barometric pressure is lower. And physiologically, one of the extraordinary things is that every lungful of air is containing fewer oxygen molecules. So here in Denver, where every lungful of air has about 80% of the oxygen molecules of sea level. At 4,000 meters on Pikes Peak, or in Tibet or the Andes, where I'll be giving you some evidence, every lungful of air only has 60% of the oxygen molecules that people at sea level have. This is a severe stress. It's unavoidable. This is not a stress like cold, where you can build a fire or you can put on a sweater. It's a stress that everyone is exposed to from conception to death at altitude. And everyone at the same altitude is exposed to the same stress. It's not as if you have a thicker coat that protects you from the cold and someone else has a thinner coat. It's a really great stress for that reason. It's unavoidable, it's severe, and everyone has the same stress. Now, something to keep in mind is that the percent of oxygen in every lungful of air, or every volume of air, is the same, regardless of the altitude. What varies is the number of oxygen molecules. So here we have a set of lungs. I've got a set of lungs here. You can pretend this is sea level. Roughly 21% of the air is oxygen. We've got nitrogen. Then when we go to 4,000 meters, we only have about 60% of the number of oxygen molecules and nitrogen molecules. So we have much less dense air. And these are the lungs. These are the alveoli. This is a cartoon of the alveoli of the lungs, the little sacs at the very end of the lungs. And this is where oxygen actually diffuses into the bloodstream. Carbon dioxide diffuses out. Here we are at sea level. Almost all the blood leaving the lungs is red or saturated with oxygen. At 4,000 meters, however, less of the blood is saturated with oxygen. More of it is these blue, unsaturated. So at sea level, we expect about 98% of the blood to be saturated, and at 4,000 meters, only about 88% if you're a Tibetan Highlander. So the result of being at higher altitude, every lungful of air has fewer oxygen molecules, less oxygen diffuses from the lung into the blood, and from there on, it's a cascade all the way through the oxygen delivery system. Now, when we looked at that earlier, all right, well, sorry about that. We saw it looked normal, didn't it, on the screen? Well, we have, imagine lungs, heart, arterial blood. The point is this oxygen cascade that I just discovered, that it eventually has a cascade down to the mitochondria. And every biology student knows what goes on in the mitochondria. It's the powerhouse. It's the powerhouse of the organism. And this powerhouse is run on oxygen. So our challenge is that here's sea level, here's the amount of oxygen in the inspired air, in the alveolus of the lung, in the artery, in the capillary. This is where it's actually giving oxygen up to the mitochondria. And at altitude, here at 15,000 feet, there's less oxygen at every point. So what's going on? How is it that they're able to sustain a healthy life and productive life? And interestingly, they do so completely comfortably. they do so completely. So here is, if we think of delivering adequate oxygen, we can think of the smallest amount of oxygen, or the lowest amount of consumption, and that's basal metabolic rate. This is what it takes, the amount of oxygen that it takes to keep us alive, to keep our hearts beating and our mitochondria on minimum, our lungs breathing. Here we are at low, well, I'm used to talking at low altitude, so I have to keep modifying this statement. At low altitude in Cleveland, where I'm from, this is what a basal metabolic rate would be. We can also measure the maximum oxygen use by giving someone an oxygen, a maximal oxygen test, like a bike test or treadmill test of maximal oxygen consumption. And we know what the average is for moderately active people. So if we think of this as the normal sea level range from 0 to 100, now think of us going to Pikes Peak, let's say. And we can measure again our basal metabolic rate. Well, our basal metabolic rate for the first few weeks of life at altitude is about 20% higher. So the adaptations, the biological adaptations that we're mounting cost energy. And if we gave ourselves a bike test of maximum oxygen consumption, it would be, well, it would depend on how fit we were. The more fit, the greater the reduction. But let's just say a reduction of 10 or 15%. So our range of oxygen consumption upon acute exposure is much narrower. Us, in this case, are being people from low altitude. What about high altitude Tibetans and Andean? And when I'm talking now about high altitude populations, I'm focusing on Tibetan and Andean. We don't have as much information yet from Ethiopia. Well, the high altitude natives have the complete range of oxygen consumption. Complete in the sense that it's the same as ours here at sea level. We can measure basal metabolic rate. It's normal for age, sex, and body weight. We can measure maximal oxygen consumption, and it's normal. So in this sense, in a very key sense, people have adapted completely. Now, where are these high altitude populations that I'm talking about? The first ones to be studied were here in the Andes, particularly in Peru and Bolivia. We're interested in the deepest red, and that's the Andes. Or some, you can see that here in Colorado, throughout the American West, there are plenty of people living 1,500, like Denver and above. But when we're studying evolution and adaptation to extreme environments, one of the reasons we want to do that is to get the most extreme stress. We're hoping to find the most extreme response. Greenland doesn't really count. This is just altitude, but that altitude is ice, so forget that. Same with Antarctica. We don't care about that. The other major area is the Tibetan Plateau. And this is the Tibetan Plateau, where I've spent a lot of time, is really wonderful because it's so stressful. That sounds a little oxymoronic, but it is. It's so stressful. And there are millions of people living there, and it's very high. All of these populations have been there for a long time. So in that basic sense, they're successful. They're reproducing, they're growing. In that sense, we're successful. We want to know what's the role of natural selection. Natural selection takes many generations. Darwin told us that. Has there been enough time? Okay. There is archaeological evidence that permanent residents have been on the Tibetan Plateau for at least 11,000 years. We've got evidence for occasional camps, and we don't know if they were permanent camps earlier, but for at least 11,000 years on the Tibetan Plateau. So that's 440 generations of 25 years. We know for some other traits that's plenty of time. but still, it's not a lot of time. Permanent residents have lived on the Andean plateau for about the same length of time. So here we've got school kids nowadays. Here they're all lined up. They're about to do their daily exercises. Same with these school kids and the Andean plateau. One of the things that's very interesting is that when we look at low altitude natives, and they could be low altitude Europeans going to high altitude in the Andes, going skiing in the Alps. They could be Chinese, Han from Beijing and Chengdu going to high altitude. They all respond pretty much in the same way to this acute exposure. And in ways that are easily measurable, that you might even be able to get your students to measure. Oxygen saturation of hemoglobin can be measured non-invasively. And it plunges. If we take someone from Stanford and up to Pikes Peak, or even from Denver up to Pikes Peak, their oxygen saturation might be 98% when they leave, and it goes down to something like 80% of their hemoglobin is carrying oxygen. You can even cause it to fall a little bit by holding your breath. So it'll be low for a few days, and then over the course of, let's say, 3 weeks, it returns a little bit towards sea level, maybe 86%. A big fall. Add other adaptations, it'll kick in, and you can increase over the course of a few weeks, but not completely retain your sea level abilities or oxygen saturation. Breathing and heart rate increase immediately. You can get off the plane in Lhasa and feel that your heart rate is faster and that your breathing is a little bit deeper. Now breathing, this is noticeable, it's also measurable. Interestingly, if you're here over the course of a few days and weeks, your breathing starts to go back to sea level levels. And you don't really notice the increase in breathing. If you stay here for years, it goes even lower. So you get to the point where you're looking at, for example, people who live in Leadville. They've been studied a lot because they're North Americans and they're easily accessible from Denver. And their breathing is very low, unexpectedly low. It's so low that it's described as blunted, almost like hypoventilation. A third thing that occurs as you arrive here, not here, a little bit here, but if you arrived in Lhasa or La Paz or Cusco, that is the concentration of red blood cells in your blood would increase. That increases within days, and that's sustained. So this is what we can think of as the ancestral or the unselected response. Yeah?
And then if the person goes back to sea level?
It goes back down.
Oh.
Yep. That's why people who train at altitude, for example, athletes like to train at altitude, it increases because of erythropoietin. This is legal doping. Yeah, right? No one cares when bicyclists come up here and train. And they increase their red blood cells, they increase their oxygen carrying capacity, because they're going to go back down to sea level, they're going to have more red blood cells, 100% saturation. Yeah?
Did I hear you correctly earlier to say that
No.
saturation you have?
No. What I said was, the more fit you are, the greater the reduction in your maximum ability. So let's say your maximum ability when you go to altitude, let's say you're a really good biker. It's measured in mLs of oxygen consumed per, and let's say your number is 60. And which is really fit, most of us who are here who are moderately fit probably have a max VO2 of around 40, 45. So we might experience a 10% reduction down, let's say, from 45 to 40. Your really fit cyclist who's at 60 or 70, they're more likely to have a reduction of 20%. And they'll be down to 45 or so. So there won't be that much difference in maximal oxygen consumption. And this, of course, is why the La Paz soccer team always wins when Brazil comes to La Paz. because there's a little leveling of physical capacity there. But you raise a very interesting question. Is there any way to predict who among us lowlanders is going to get sick? No, really, be unable to sleep, feel the nausea and the dizziness and the vomiting, and there is no way.
Well, it's erratic. I mean,
Yep.
I could get a break from teaching.
Yep, I love it. Thank you so much for saying that. But once we're hot on the track of some tests, and that would be a really useful practical outcome if we could really identify what's the key element. Because I've just given you here a suite of 2 or 3 things from a huge panel of things that change, biological characteristics that change, and we genuinely don't know what's going to predict who does well and who doesn't. Now, if Highlanders have different responses, then we hypothesize that adaptation has occurred. What we really want to know is that adaptation heritable. So Highlanders from the Andean plateau and the Tibetan plateau both differ from lowlanders who are acutely exposed. And heart rate is an example. Both of them have normal heart rates. So they don't have elevated heart rates. Okay. Andean and Tibetan Highlanders also differ from one another. And this turns out to be some of the strongest evidence that we have for evolution by natural selection. And breathing is one of a really good example. I said that when we go to altitude, we increase our breathing a lot. And that increase declines, fades over days, and it actually fades into hypoventilation if we stay long enough. That's for years. Andean Highlanders have a similar model, and that is that they hypoventilate compared to what we would expect. And this has been a puzzle for a really long time. At first it was said, well, of course they hypoventilate because they're not spending energy on ventilating. You couldn't do that. Well, then we started getting evidence from Tibetans. Tibetans breathe, they hyperventilate from birth till death. They have levels of breathing that's almost twice that of us. And they do so, and they can actually increase from that when they exercise. So breathing is a nice example of how Tibetan and Andean Highlanders differ. A little bit of a hint that there's something different going on in Tibetan and Andean Highlanders. We can look at our 2 other things that I've been talking about, hemoglobin concentration and oxygen concentration. And I'm showing you a little bit of data so that you could actually get some numbers, some sense of the size of the differences. Let's look first at oxygen saturation of hemoglobin. This is how much of the percent of your oxygen that's carrying, the percent of your hemoglobin rather, that's carrying oxygen. And these blue are Tibetans and the gold are the Andean Highlanders. And here are males and females. And this is from a study that I did that studied at 4,000 meters. So we've got people at the same altitudes. I used the same equipment. I used the same recruitment mechanisms, the same to get people to be invited to participate, same exclusion techniques. And we found that the Tibetans have lower oxygen saturation of hemoglobin than their Andean counterparts at the same altitude. So they're living at the same altitude, they're exposed to the same stress, but Tibetans have lower oxygen saturation by about 3%. It's true for males, it's true for females, it's true throughout adulthood. Well, okay, so they have lower. They could offset that, right, by having higher hemoglobin concentrations. Maybe they don't have so much saturation, but they have bigger sponges, if you think of your red cell mass as a big sponge. Well, Tibetans do not. They have lower oxygen saturation. These values, This is for males, 15.6 grams per DL. That's the same as men at sea level. Tibetans can live as high as 3,900, 40,000 meters, not 40,000, 4,000 meters without an elevation of hemoglobin concentration. Same for women. Look at the Andean Highlanders. They have what we would expect. They have higher hemoglobin concentrations. And here's a comparison of males. 15.6, 19.2. Now, those numbers don't necessarily mean anything unless you're really into hemoglobin, like I am. But look at the percent difference. It's huge. If you went to the doctor and you had levels like this or levels like this, your doctor probably would say, oh, I think we need to look into this, right? But these are healthy people. And also notice how much variation there is. We need variation. We know we need variation for natural selection to occur. So we've got a couple of kinds of variation going on between populations and within populations. How do we measure whether or not any of that variation has a heritable basis? There are a couple of ways to do it. One is with a measure called H squared, or heritability. And people don't like this measure. and it can be easily misinterpreted. In order to get a heritability tells us the fraction of this variation within a population that is attributable to genetic relationships among individuals, genetic variation among individuals. So we need relatives. So what these samples are samples of hundreds of relatives. There are over 400 in Tibet, over 600 in in Bolivia. So we had big samples. And we had aunts and uncles and parents and offspring, and we know how correlated they should be if a trait were completely genetically determined. The traits were not completely genetically determined, like ABO blood group. But we did find something very interesting, which was about 35% of the variance in the Tibetans was accounted for by genetic factors. None among the Andean Highlanders. This right there is indirect evidence that there may be different genes contributing to variation in these traits in the two populations. Perhaps natural selection has had a sweep, and everyone is genetically the same for traits relating to oxygen saturation in the Andes, but not in Tibet. We don't know that yet, but this is indirect evidence for population differences. The heritability for hemoglobin concentration was extraordinary. There's genetic variation in both of those populations. The percent of it, almost 90% of the differences within the populations are due to genetic factors. It does not tell us whether the genes are different, whether the genetic factors are different in these two populations. It just tells us that there is genetic variation. That's great, because it tells us, whoa, there's an opportunity for natural selection. So if we're going to follow this up, we would say hemoglobin looks like a good place to look. Oxygen saturation looks like a good place to look, only in Tibet. We put these two things together. Arterial oxygen content is a function of oxygen saturation and hemoglobin. Tibetans have the lower saturation, they have the lower hemoglobin. Their arterial oxygen content is really low. This arrow is us here, not us, is sea level, me from Cleveland. By this measure, you'd say Tibetans, they're under stress. They have not yet compensated. Andean Highlanders, well, they've overdone it. We now know, and of course we want to know why, what's going on. Well, we pursued the oxygen saturation trait in the Tibetan Highlanders. And we found that Tibetans have a major gene for high oxygen saturation of hemoglobin. A major gene is a gene whose locus we don't know, but we can infer it from the pedigrees. We have lots of relatives, and we've measured their oxygen saturation, and we can examine that pattern of oxygen saturation and how it is distributed throughout pedigrees, and we see that high saturation is inherited as if it's an autosomal dominant trait. Some people, healthy people, have saturations. Here we've got the husband and a wife at 4,000 meters. They're exposed to the same stress. They're both healthy. The husband has a saturation of 90. The wife has a saturation of 80. Their two kids are heterozygous, and it's an autosomal dominant trait. They've got high saturation. One of their grandchildren, no, I said that wrong. This is their child, the daughter, and she finds a heterozygote to marry. So now we've got two heterozygotes for the autosomal dominant for high saturation. And they have a child, well, at least one of their kids is likely to be homozygous, recessive for this low trait. Now, we don't know where the locus is. We're making the inference from statistical analyses. So we've got two lines of evidence that there's heritable variation. And this is nice. So what about it? What about natural selection? The currency of natural selection is children. So we did a survey of 14 villages in Tibet. We went to every household and invited them to participate. We got their pedigrees. We got the women's fertility experiences. And we measured oxygen saturation. And we estimated the women's genotypes. So here are their genotypes. Maybe they're low saturation homozygote, or a heterozygote, or a homozygote for the high oxygen saturation. Number of pregnancies and births that they reported, the same. Number of living children that they reported, wow, more than double for the high oxygen saturation. Now remember, they're more like sea level. So this makes some sense. And the explanation was infant deaths. The women with the low oxygen saturation, homozygote, estimated genotypes, had many fewer surviving children, many more infant deaths. So this suggests that natural selection is acting on this gene at high altitude to increase the frequency of whatever that oxygen high saturation allele is. I have to emphasize that thousands of high-altitude natives participated in this. And we need to recognize when we do field work, yes, not only do I have lots of scientific colleagues, but also lots of collaborators, people who welcomed me into their camps, into their tents, and their villages. So in summary, Tibetan and Andean Highlanders have quantitatively different adaptations to high-altitude hypoxia. Your students will be able to understand that hypoxia is extremely stressful and uniformly stressful. It makes a good natural experiment. We can test the unselected response by testing ourselves. We can identify different responses among Highlanders as compared to acutely exposed people. We can identify heritable variation in the Highlanders. And we have an example then, linking heritable variation to natural selection for a trait in the direction that offsets the stress of high-altitude hypoxia. Field studies are crucial for understanding questions like this. We wouldn't have even known to ask the question about population difference if we hadn't done field work. Thank you very much for your attention. I already see a question over there.